Boy, oh boy, is it a wild morning in sports. I was ready to come on and have a nice little chat. I was going to chat about my observations about watching sports all weekend, what I thought no fans was looking like on the television screen, and I thought we were going to have a nice, lovely beginning to the week here on the Jmull Show. Well, that's certainly not the case anymore. Not even kind of the case, because not only do we have big news, we have big news that honestly might end the baseball season. It might stop the momentum that the football season has in its tracks. And it might make it completely clear that any sport that's trying to do anything where teams are traveling rather than being in a bubble is not possible. It's just logistically impossible. It's too scary, it's too dangerous, and it's putting athletes at unnecessary risk. If you're just waking up this morning, and that's certainly a fair thing, it's only 10. If you're just waking up, 14 different people have tested positive for COVID-19 in the Marlins club. 14. You had several players. You had 4 players prior to Sunday's game against the Phillies, and then now 8 more players and 2 coaches have tested positive for COVID-19. It's an outbreak. An outbreak. Here's the thing. If there are 4 new cases in a club really close together, there's probably going to be more, because that means COVID-19 is in the clubhouse somewhere. Somebody has gotten it and has been passing it around the club. When that happens, games should not be played. They should not be played. It is that simple. How in the world Rob Manfred let it happen is absolutely ridiculous, and is just another indication of how he continues to fail as the commissioner of baseball. Chris Brown's going to talk to us at 10:20. 110 Sports baseball expert. I texted him this morning, said, I know it's short notice, but let's talk baseball on the show. And he said, I just rolled out of bed, just saw the news, let's do it. So we're going to do that at 10:20, about 15 minutes or so. After that, I am going to talk about some of my observations when it comes to no fans. I think it's an interesting conversation. I think it works, and I'll tell you why at 10:40. Of course, that's what I was going to start the show with, because I thought, it's a relatively slow day in terms of crazy sports news. So we're just going to have a conversation. We're going to talk a little NBA. NBA is getting closer and closer. And now we have something that might completely change the way that sports are approached in this COVID-19 era, if not cancel all traveling sports altogether. That might be a little bit of an overreaction at this point, but I think it's a possibility. But we'll get Chris Brown here at 10:20 to talk about it. And then we'll talk no fans at stadiums, what the MLB is doing, what the NBA is doing in the bubble, and then hit some FYI and get out of here for the day. And hopefully we got baseball to talk about on Wednesday. That's kind of where I'm at right now. Hopefully we've got baseball to talk about on Wednesday. But let me lay a couple things out, and let's just have a conversation before we talk to Chris. I want to get some of my thoughts out there prior to getting Chris on here, so we can hear what he has to say, what he thinks about this, being our baseball guy over at 110 Sports. So just some of the facts. 14 cases in the club in recent days. Jeff Passan of ESPN reporting this morning that 8 more players, 2 more coaches, bringing the total in recent days up to roughly 14, at least 14, and there could be more. 14 cases in the Marlins club in the last 4 days. That's so many cases. That's a good chunk. A third, if not more, of the traveling party of the Marlins. And here's the other issue here is, and this is the issue that I think really will be the most telling when it comes to whether or not the baseball season will actually continue. The first is, well, first it's ridiculous, like I said, that Manfred let the Phillies and Marlins game yesterday happen. It should have never happened. And the effects of that game happening might completely end the baseball scene, because if a bunch of Phillies players get sick, or the away team clubhouse staff that the Phillies have at their stadium, if any of those people get sick, then it's clear that playing games with players that are COVID-19 positive, we don't quite know yet, because there is some gray area here. You get tested on a Monday morning. Even if you get your test back on a Tuesday morning and you have a game Tuesday night, that's 48 hours in a hotel in a city you're not playing in, that you're unfamiliar with, how you're going to keep yourself safe in that city. You've got 48 hours to catch the virus without anybody knowing. And even if you get tested the morning of the game, you're probably not going to get those results back until the next morning. So you could be going out and playing without symptoms and nobody will know it. And that's scary, because in the NBA, there's a really good chance that if somebody gets tested on a Monday morning before a game on Tuesday night, and they get their test back, Monday evening, Tuesday morning, there's a really good chance that in the bubble, they didn't contract the virus. There's a really good chance. The same can't be said for baseball. When you're traveling around the country, when you're on flights, when you're, in these pressurized cabins, when you're in hotels, when you're traveling to the stadium, when you're around bus drivers, so on and so forth, it's so much more difficult to keep it under control. It's so much more difficult to know where everybody's been. It's so much more difficult to know where every player has been, not just the people, who are at the front desk of the hotel, or who are holding the doors open for you, who are cleaning your rooms. It's, where have the players been? Did they get too close to somebody walking in the hotel? They get too close to somebody, in the elevator? Did they get too close to somebody walking through a door? There are just so many instances where they can pick it up and just not know before it's too late. It's funny, you would think that them coming from Miami would be the issue, and that might have something to do with it. But the Braves are without their top two catchers right now because they were showing symptoms for COVID-19. Guess who the Marlins played an exhibition before the season started? The Atlanta Braves. And that it would even add to it if players are have tested positive, and they trace it back to that Braves game. Because then this is impossible to do. Because it's impossible to get immediate test results. And so therefore it's impossible to be completely sure that nobody is taking the field and be 100% sure that there aren't a couple guys out there that have tested positive for COVID-19 and just don't know it yet. Because you have to test a couple of days before the game. And when you're when you're playing 60 games in 66 days, and this was something I hadn't thought about before, but if you're playing games so frequently, there's not enough time. There's not enough time to make sure that your team is COVID-19 negative all the time. It's impossible. Because you're playing 3 games in 3 days, and in theory, if you get them to Philly and nobody's positive, the chances are better that you're not going to contract anything in those 3 days, but it's certainly not out of the question. But if you're playing 6 games in 7 days, and you get tested after the last game of the first series, it's impossible to know if everyone's still healthy. So many variables. Which is why the bubble makes the most sense, and it's why it's really unfortunate that Major League Baseball couldn't sell their Players Association on a bubble. Because what's gonna be 100% true as a result of this is that people are gonna, maybe it'll make people realize that the only way to have sports right now, the only way to have sports that have any sort of contact, apart from, the PGA Tour, has a traveling bubble right now. It's impossible to do this outside of a bubble, because what a bubble does is takes out that biggest variable. It takes out that biggest variable of way too much travel, of way too much interaction with people you don't know where they've been, and way too much time that you don't know what the players are doing. The players in the bubble are on a very strict schedule. That was part of the release of the health and safety documents from the NBA. There's a very strict schedule. And as a result, the NBA knows and the teams know where their players are at all times. And I guess to a certain extent that's true for baseball as well, but it's certainly not to the same extent. And as a result, you have this kind of thing happen. It's impossible to control it all. And what you're as a result, you're getting way too many positive tests. You're getting COVID-19 spreading through an entire clubhouse. And it's unfortunate, but it's a sport trying to do something like this that is really complex and really risky, with a commissioner who is an idiot, doesn't care about the sport, and clearly doesn't care about the players. He cares about the money that's being made. That's about it. Because if he cared about the players and not about the money being made, that Phillies Marlins game wouldn't have happened yesterday. And that's one of the things that Manfred needs to answer for now. There needs to be some sort of explanation why he let that game happen, because it should have never happened. It's common sense. If 4 players tested positive, it's somewhere in the clubhouse. Obviously, it's somewhere in the clubhouse. I mean, if 1 player tests positive, there's an argument that it's somewhere. Obviously, it's somewhere in the clubhouse. But if it's 4 players, somebody clearly had it for longer than you thought they did, and it was a while before they got tested, and they knew that they had it, and they'd given it to a bunch of people. 14 players. 14. I guess it would be this way. 14. Exactly. No tracing either. How does that... I mean, it makes sense because, this is the same sport that had a team that didn't have a home stadium on opening day. And this is a sport that came back really fast relative to when their plan was set in place. The NBA's plan was set in place for months before it actually came back. Baseball sort of threw a plan together and then said, okay, we're coming back in 3 weeks. You have to know where everybody is at all times, who they've come in contact with, their symptoms, all of it. So here's what needs to happen. First, the season needs to be suspended until everybody who's come in contact with the Marlins in the last week and a half, everybody, tests negative. You quarantine the Marlins team until everybody is tested negative. Everybody. And you suspend the season until everybody who has come in contact with them, and everybody who's come in contact with the guys who came in contact with the Marlins, have tested negative. That's the only way to make sure that this ends there. That's the only way. Because if you don't, the Phillies can't go play their next series now. No way. There's no way. that the Phillies can go play there next. They can't let another team into their ballpark. They can't go to another ballpark. There's no way. The events that could happen and that will probably happen as a result of this, the only way to make sure those things don't happen is to suspend everything. And honestly, they should take a really hard look at suspending the entire season. They should take a really hard look at that because it didn't take long. Clearly, it was, I mean, we're 3 days into the season, 4 days. And there's a really good chance that the Marlins contracted it from the Braves before the season even started. That's all you need to know. If we're only 4 days into the season, and there already is this issue, the only place that we can go from here is up. Because the only place we can go from here is more games. And more interaction, and more travel, and more uncertainty. The NBA was in a position where they had 0 positive cases. That's where every league should start. 0 positive cases. And if there are more cases, you adjust accordingly. There's part of me that thinks that the MLB season shouldn't have been allowed to start until everybody was negative. I mean, right? I mean, that would make sense because if not everybody tested negative, if the Braves guys are testing positive, that means COVID-19 is somewhere in the clubhouse. By definition. So why are they being allowed to go play games? That fails the out loud test. Guys in that close proximity, that much of the time, if there's one guy in the clubhouse, there's probably more. So why are they being allowed to take the field? Why are they being allowed to take the field? And it doesn't have to be for very long. But if somebody tests positive on Tuesday from the Braves, or Wednesday or Thursday, it should be at least 2 or 3 days before that team is allowed to play a baseball game. 2, 3, 4 days. You test everybody multiple times. You quarantine the guys that have it. And if you've tested everybody in 4 days and everybody else has come back negative, then there's probably a pretty good chance they didn't give it to anybody. But until then, they shouldn't be able to take the field. And they certainly shouldn't be able to take the field like the Marlins were able to take the field on Sunday in Philadelphia, when 4 players have tested positive. And there were people awaiting results. Like, what? There's just no way that happened. There's no way. And Manfred needs to answer for it. He needs to answer for it now, quickly. Like, before this show is over in 40 minutes, Manfred should have said something. We'll see, though, because there's no reason to have any faith in Manfred. Very little reason. But this is bad news for every sport that is trying to travel and play games in the COVID-19 pandemic. Really bad news. Really bad news. And what I think we're going to learn at the end of this is that that's impossible to have sports where you're traveling. And the teams in the bubbles are the ones who did the right thing the first time and are proving. There have been, knock on wood, there's been no issues with cases in the NBA bubble. None. 14 cases on one baseball team in the last 3 days. That's all you need to know about how difficult it is to run a league where you're traveling relative to how easy it is to run a league once you get everything logistically in place from a bubble. We're going to talk to Chris Brown about this coming up next. I mean, this is big news. He'll have more intelligent things to say about it than I will. We'll see what he thinks about whether the season should continue, what Manfred should do, and how ridiculous it is that the Marlins were able to play yesterday. We'll do all of that next with Chris Brown. You're watching the Jmull Show on 110sportsmedia.com. Welcome back to the Jmull Show on a busy, way more exciting morning than I thought it would be. And when it's an exciting morning in the baseball world, that means we have Chris Brown to come and talk about it. Chris Brown at CBrownSports on Twitter. My esteemed colleague at 110sportsmedia.com covers all things baseball for us. He does a fantastic job. If you haven't followed him on Twitter, you really should. Chris Brown. Chris, how you doing on a wild Monday, to say the least?
Yeah, wild to say the least, Josh, and I'm doing all right. Thanks for having me on. Obviously, wish it was better circumstances, of course, than we have this morning. But yeah, it's going to be an interesting next 24 hours for baseball. That's for sure.
So we'll start there. Give me your best prediction for the next 24 hours in baseball. What's going to happen?
Wow. That's the $1 million question. I mean, I think there's what should happen, and then there's what will happen. And I think I agree with you in what should happen is that the season needs to be at the very least put on pause and evaluated, because this is clearly not. There needs to be some real looking in the mirror about what's going on right now, and the processes and the testing processes, and if this is really going to be able to work or not. And so I think there needs to at least be the pause button hit, but it's being reported now, John Hammond of MLB Network reporting that there's been no serious discussion about pausing or suspending the season, which I think is just insane. Yeah. I think that it needs to at least be a very serious discussion about the possibility of suspending or pausing the season at this point. Mm-hmm. One way or another, baseball needs to provide some answers. I think there's going to need to be some answers by this afternoon and this evening about what the plan is moving forward. I'm sure there's a lot of scrambling right now. I find it difficult to believe that this is going to be able to continue. I mean, just for a number of reasons. I was just reading a report. The LA Times talked to an epidemiologist from Emory University who says he would recommend shutting down the Marlins organization for at least 2 weeks.
Yeah.
So I don't see how this is the kind of thing that we can just wait a few days of pause and everything's okay.
Right.
So I'm pretty pessimistic right now that this is going to be able to continue, but I don't know. Well, I guess we'll have to see.
Yeah, and when you start to think about all the tracing that needs to be done with anybody that the Marlins came in contact with. I mean, you have to go all the way back to the Braves. I mean, there's been talks about maybe that being sort of the epicenter, so to speak, of this. The Braves had 2 catchers go on the injured list because they had symptoms for COVID-19. And then everybody since then that the Marlins have come in contact with needs to be tested at the very least. I mean, everybody, all the clubhouse staff from Philadelphia, every Phillies player. I mean, I don't see how the Phillies players can play their next series. Like, that doesn't make any sense either. The snowball gets really big really fast when you think about all the little pieces, all the little nooks and crannies that have to be cleaned out, so to speak, before anybody who came in contact with the Marlins, the Marlins can actually continue with the season. And then you're talking about 14 days in a 66-day season. That's more than that's almost 25% of your season that is gone if you need to quarantine, and you should quarantine, quite frankly, for those 14 days.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's it. This isn't the kind of process where you can just, from my understanding and from what I'm seeing, the experts saying, this isn't the kind of thing where you can just be like, okay, let's hit pause on the Marlins for 2 days and a couple other teams for 2 days, and then just start it back up again and it'll be fine, because that's not enough to guarantee that things have been sorted out. Because you can't do this sloppily. I mean, you can't just sort of say, well, we'll give it a few days, we'll take out the players who may have tested positive. I mean, the Marlins are still waiting on more test results. There's a chance that there could be even, it would seem like a pretty decent chance that there are more positive tests as well. So, I mean, this isn't as simple as just, like, give it a few days and then get back at it. It's, like you said, it's a really complicated process. The amount of people who the team has come into contact with over the past few days is huge, and they're all going to have to be tested. Those tests are going to take, as we've seen, a couple of days potentially to process. So, yeah, like you said, this is much more complicated than just hitting pause for a day or two.
I think it was one of the things that I didn't think about until now was just, if there's one thing the NFL has going for it, it's that, after you play your Sunday game, you immediately fly to wherever your next game is going to be, whether that's at home or whether that's, in Pittsburgh, if you're the Browns. You fly to Pittsburgh and you quarantine in your hotel for 3 days, and then it's Wednesday, and assuming that all of your tests are negative, then you have a mini bubble, so to speak. It's got holes in it for sure, but you have something a little closer, and you've been in the same place for so long that you at least can have some sort of assurance, at least more than baseball, that you're putting 22 guys on the field, that you have a really good shot that all of them are negative. For baseball, when you're playing so many games so quickly, they're getting their test back fast, but they're not getting their test back in 15 minutes. So you're putting yourself in a situation where, especially when you're on the road, it's so easy to have contracted the virus in the 12 hours it's been since you got tested, and you have to go play a game, and you don't know what your results are yet, or if you've contracted it in the 12 hours after you've gotten your test. There's so many moving parts here. Would you agree with that it's just so hard from a volume perspective to play 60 games in 66 days when you're sort of at the mercy of how long it takes to get test results back?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good point. Like you said, exactly. There's the amount of travel that's happening in such a short period of time, the amount of games that are happening day after day after day, teams with, 6 games in 6 days in different periods without, off days, who are traveling from the road to home to the road again in a few days. The turnaround on tests just isn't fast enough, and that's, obviously that's just the reality of the situation right now. That's not but like you said, in a situation where you're playing, one game a week on Sundays, it's a lot different. There's more time to sort of just to check in and make sure that everything is sort of, everyone's tested negative and get those results processed before it's time for the, next round of games the next week. Baseball doesn't have that, ability to do that because of the schedule, and that's a really good point, because it's like we're seeing, we have a situation where one team has a number of positive tests, and like you said, the ripple effect of what team did they just play, and the team that they just played, well, who did they just play, and who are they going to play, and who, what's next, and what teams are impacted. And since they're trying to cram so many games in such a short period, there's already been talk about, they don't want to push the playoffs deeper into, into November, and we don't know, who knows what it's going to be like, by then in this country. So I don't even know, if you were to pause the season even for, a couple of weeks and really get everything squared away, I don't even know how you adjust the schedule, because I just don't even know how you fix that given the nature of the schedule, exactly like you said.
Do you think, is there anything that could have been done to avoid this? I mean, there's certainly there's certainly holes in baseball's health and safety, and there's not enough tracing throughout the league. Is this the kind of thing that could have been avoided, or is this, which is, I think, might be even scarier for sports who are trying to travel during this time in our country? Is this even avoidable in your opinion, or was it something that was bound to happen? It's just maybe a little more severe than it could have been just because there are some shortcomings from Major League Baseball.
Yeah, of course, I guess that's the big question when it comes to, like you said, the future of other sports in this country in the upcoming, weeks and months from now. And, it's I guess in some sense impossible to answer because we don't know, how things would have gone in a different scenario. But I think at the same time, I guess one thing I think is that you have to note, in talking about this, that this is the Miami Marlins in a state that is right now a hot spot and has been a hot spot for coronavirus cases in this country, in Florida.
Right.
And the idea being, just like you said, the fact that there is no bubble for baseball, which, does bring with it other complications that would have had to have been figured out. But the fact that there's no bubble means these Marlins players, after the games, are returning home to their families, to, go to the grocery store, to go home to people who haven't been quarantined, who had to, go out and get groceries, who had to go out into a community that right now is really struggling with containing COVID-19. So part of me feels like when you have a situation where the players are going to be going home to interact with people who weren't quarantined, it's not enclosed in a bubble, that there's some unfortunate inevitability of the situation. I don't know that for sure, but it kind of seems like it, given the situation. So it kind of seems like one of those things that it's sort of the risk that baseball took with the system of not being a bubble, which, of course, there's risks in the bubble, and the bubble can break down, in the NBA or wherever. But it's one of the things that when you have, it's not as if it's a non-bubble, but all these teams are playing from very, great areas where the virus is contained. I mean, it's, again, like we said, the Marlins in one of the biggest hot spots in the country right now. So.
Right. It's unfortunate that there aren't a whole lot of baseball teams playing in, Jackson Hole, Wyoming. They tend to be the baseball teams tend to find themselves in cities, and cities tend to be the place where COVID-19 is spreading, just because the, number of people per square mile in those cities. Yeah, it's unfortunate. I think, I'm a little bit of the belief that as a result of this, we're going to really come to the conclusion that bubbles are the only way to make sports work right now. Am I overreacting? Would you agree with that? Would you disagree with that? Are you not ready to, or quite ready to pull the plug? Because I think, this is really bad for the NFL and the MLS, who is going to try to travel after the MLS's back tournament is over. It's really hard to say that traveling sports nowadays are going to work when the first team sport to do it is, seeing crisis, and we're barely through the first series of the season.
Yeah, I don't think that's necessarily an overreaction. There's a part of me that doesn't want to, is cautious not to maybe, react too much. But at the same time, like you said, there's just the nature of the way these things are set up. The way, the nature of the differences between the bubble and the possibilities that exist when the players are free to and going to react, are going to interact with family and community members who are potentially exposed and not quarantined, I think that's a potential. I mean, that's a logical conclusion that I think could definitely, be true, be the case that that sports aren't really going to be able to sustain themselves in this environment without the bubble. I think that's definitely a strong possibility.
The more important question is, do you think Manfred will ever come to that conclusion? Let me ask it this way. If this doesn't suspend the MLB season indefinitely, what's going to have to happen for Manfred to suspend the season? Is it scary what it'll have to get to before he'll do that? How much faith do you have in Manfred to make the right health and safety decision surrounding cases in Major League Baseball?
I will say I don't have a ton of faith in the commissioner right now. I mean, I don't necessarily, think that he's, I think that he cares about, I think he cares about this, obviously, the sport and the players. He want this to get out of control to an extreme level. But I think I think what would cause the season to get shut down isn't necessarily, it's not all in his hands. I mean, if enough owners say this is not going to work, if enough players are saying we're not comfortable, we're opting out, if owners are saying this isn't going to work, this is too problematic, then eventually Manfred's left with no choice.
Right.
I'm not necessarily saying it's going to get to that point, that this decision could be, we don't really know how this is going to go. I'm just reading that baseball has a call scheduled with all its 30 owners today at 12:30 Eastern.
Gotcha.
So I imagine we'll have some answers after that, one way or another, some sort of a statement.
Right.
So maybe it doesn't come to that. But I think there's the reality that I don't think this is going to keep, the season's not going to be able to just keep chugging on if Manfred wants it, if the players, if the owners, if the teams are not comfortable with it, because they do have power in the situation to opt out, to say, we don't want to do this, and, baseball can't just keep chugging on. So I think, in some sense, that's sort of the reality of it, that the players and the owners do have power to put the brakes on this.
This isn't unique to baseball, but I've seen on Twitter, in the last hour or so, two different camps, I guess. One is, this is indicative of how difficult and logistically impossible it is to have sports traveling in this country right now. And the other camp I'm seeing is positive COVID tests of professional athletes are an expected roadblock, bump in the road, and that it won't be the reason that seasons, leagues are suspended. My question for you is this an expected roadblock? Is this an expected bump, or is this closer to crisis and closer to the other camp of indicative of how tough this is to do and how almost impossible it is to do logistically? Where would you lean in that battle, so to speak?
Yeah, I would certainly lean toward the idea that this is more of a crisis. This is not just the kind of thing that we can just say, it's expected and these players are young and they'll be fine, because we've seen, first of all, that just because these, professional athletes are younger and healthy and they'll largely, the odds are they're going to be able to be okay. Many of them may not even experience symptoms, but that's not always the case. We've seen professional baseball players get, really battle with this. We've seen just in the last day or two, Eduardo Rodriguez, a pitcher for the Red Sox, is dealing with a heart condition as a result of having COVID-19. So you have that in there. First of all, this can be very serious for players.
Right.
Then you throw in the fact that these players are going home to interact with family members who are older and who may have conditions of their own.
Right.
You have the coaches who are older on these teams, the staff at the hospital, at the hotels, and the places where these players are staying. All of a sudden, there's a lot of people in here who, first of all, it's not safe for the players. It's not the kind of thing where, just because most people younger people may not have great symptoms doesn't mean it's just safe for players and it's okay, it's to be accepted. And then you have those outside realities of the people that the players are interacting with. And I keep coming back this morning to a quote from Nationals closer Sean Doolittle back from a couple of months ago. It got the headlines when he said it. And, he just said, sports are like the reward for a functioning society.
Mm.
And the reality is, right now in this country, we are not a well-functioning society,
Right.
and containing COVID-19. And people, want sports back, of course, and the comparisons are made to other countries where sports are back.
Right.
But the reality is that we're not controlling, in this country, the virus is not being controlled
Right.
like it should be. And, we can't just expect that we can have sports back and that sports are going to be, outside of the realities of the country right now.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just keep coming back to that. The reality is, we need to get a better handle on this as a country before we can expect sports to come back without a hitch.
That's an incredibly accurate way to look at it. I mean, you go to work every day, and then on Saturday you hang out and play games and have fun after the work week is over as a reward. And I think that's a pretty accurate way to put that, and certainly is something that is lost in this country, that it's almost it's our birthright to have sports in this country rather than it being a pastime. I mean, there's a reason it's called baseball, America's pastime, and not America's necessity, so to speak. Chris, thank you so much for hopping on the show. Thanks on such short notice to chat some baseball on a much wilder morning than I thought it would be.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on, Josh.
Have a good one. That's Chris Brown at C Brown Sports on Twitter, our 110 Sports baseball guy. He's phenomenal. If you're not following him on Twitter, you should. I asked him that question about, is this a road block, a speed bump, or closer to crisis? Because, I mean, Doug Gottlieb tweeting, "Dear sports writers, positive COVID tests of professional athletes are not a death sentence, just an expected roadblock in the MLB season." First of all, that's an incredibly insensitive thing to say when COVID-19 can absolutely be a death sentence. It's killed hundreds of thousands of people in this country, and to say something like that is completely tone deaf and, quite frankly, a disgrace. And on the other, it's not a roadblock. This is indicative of how impossible it is, because a speed bump is one guy getting COVID-19 and he's not able to start at second base and nobody else gets it, and that's fine. They lose a game because of it, maybe, and they move on. That's an expected roadblock. Having to cancel games, having an entire clubhouse get sick, and it's spreading around the league, that is not a roadblock. That is evidence that it shouldn't be done, and evidence that it's really hard to be successful at running a sports league that is traveling around the country. Coming up next, we're going to talk about fans and stadiums, more specifically the lack thereof and how it looked on TV over the weekend. I want to pivot the conversation a little bit just to talk about something different, but we'll do that next on the Jmull Show on 110sportsmedia.com. Welcome back to the Jmull Show on a Monday, a busy Monday, an exciting Monday. Thank you so much again, Chris Brown, for joining us on the show on such short notice. Really appreciate that, Chris. You know, the talk of the sports world this morning, of course, and as it should be, and it's not exactly surprising, but the Marlins, 14 cases in their clubhouse in the last 4 days. Really not good. And we'll see what that actually means for Major League Baseball and sports traveling in this country over the next couple days. We're gonna hear what the results of this are. But what I want to talk about now is what it looked like on TV to watch sports with no fans. I think it's quite an interesting discussion, and to look at two different sports that are televised in two fundamentally different ways, from Major League Baseball to the NBA. I think it's an incredibly interesting discussion. First of all, this is not a speech about how hard it's going to be to get used to no fans in the stadiums. Like, that's just a thing. That's how it's going to be. It takes about 3 seconds to getting used to, and it's going to look the same on screen the entire season. So let's not overreact about that or anything. But here's the thesis, I guess. It doesn't impact what's happening on the field, of course. That's the most important part of this. What I've learned is how little of an impact fans make on me in a season, in a stadium. I'm learning that I just don't care what the fans are doing. In basketball, you see maybe the first 4 rows of the stadium, maybe. And then the rest of the shot is so tight on the court that you don't see, unless they pan or cut to the crowd during a timeout or after a big shot. Then you see the fans. But if you just keep it tight on the game, then there's very little places where the fans show up on the screen. And then, in the NBA, I think they've done a really nice job with camera angles to sort of put you in the stadium. They've got that, the rail camera that's right along the court, that gives you sort of that if you're sitting on the sideline. Like you're sitting courtside. I think that's really cool. And then you get a chance to hear everybody talking, and I think that's one of the cooler, me being a sports nut, one of the cooler parts of not being able to hear anything is one of the cool parts about no fans is being able to see and hear what the players are saying to each other. Because there's so much conversation going on the court that you never realize. And getting to hear that is so cool. And it's part of the reason why commentators need to shut up sometimes. Just be quiet. Because what's happening on the court is so much more interesting than what you can be saying. I think that's what, and most commentators need to understand that. Just let the ambient noise do its thing. But just let the ambient noise be. And there's going to be plenty of sound to make it not weird. And it's a little different in baseball because there's not as much ambient sound, but there's certainly enough. You just add another mic somewhere on the field to pick up some of the conversation, and you deal with the backlash of what you might hear every once in a while later, because for the most part it's just going to be cool conversation about shifts in the infield. It's conversations between infielders about who's gonna get the bag if he steals, so on and so forth. Even little things like what the guys are saying to each other after an out when they turn around and give the signal for how many outs in the outfield. You can't tell you how many times you see that, and there are guys chuckling at each other because of something that was said that you just didn't hear. The pumping the crowd noise in is it's definitely a little forced, and while I get it for the big plays, it's certainly a little it was a little overused, especially in the NBA. There was lots of using the chants and using sort of recordings of crowd noise to make it feel like crowds were there, and it almost and that combined with the PA announcer, who was way too loud, by the way, way too loud. They're drowning out some of what the commentator said, and I know that's kind of the opposite of what I was just talking about when it comes to commentators, but that PA announcer, so it's almost like they're trying too hard to pump noise into the arena, especially in basketball. You get the shoes squeaking, you can hear the players interacting, and then you've got the commentary. That's plenty of noise. I mean, I don't understand why. I mean, you can barely hear the PA announcer on a regular broadcast. I don't understand why you necessarily have to pump it way in more just because there are no fans. I in my opinion, I think that's silly and an overreaction to trying to pump more sound into the stadium. As for the way they're putting fans into the stadium, the big screens along the sideline for basketball, I think are cool. What they can do with that is pretty neat. And there have been reports that they're going to have up to 300 fans on those screens, sort of like Zoom calls, so that there are actually faces there and reactions, and that's pretty cool. I think it would be even cooler if you could get the noise from that, but that's really, you can be a little worried about what sound you actually pick up from there. So I understand why there's no sound coming from those Zoom video feeds, wherever they're coming from. But I think that's pretty cool to get actual reaction, and it's certainly way cooler. It's certainly way cooler than the cardboard cutouts behind home plate. I mean, I get it. It's painfully obvious that the seats behind home plate are empty when there's nobody there. But man, it's just weird when the same three people are smiling real big at you the entire game. They're right over the umpire's left ear. So you're looking at the umpire to see if it's a strike or a ball all game. And you're just seeing like this woman smiling real big at you right behind his ear. It's a little off-putting. Less fans. We either need cardboard cutouts with less detail, as in like the game shot just allows for less detail, or we just need to leave them there. I saw, on Fox when the Brewers-Cubs game yesterday, when the Cubs player hit a home run, there was like it was almost like 2K. It was like watching 2K, or excuse me, not 2K, the show, watching MLB The Show with the fake fans out in the audience. And that was a little weird too, because they just sort of pop up, because it's you don't have time to prepare for a home run, so you have to cut really quick to the camera that's showing the ball going over the fence, and most of the time the fake fans aren't ready yet, so they just sort of all appear, and then the crowd noise comes and everything else, and it's just a little bit off-putting in my opinion. But here's the thing. It's an unnecessary thing to complain about. I mean, we might not be getting baseball for nearly as long as people thought we were going to be getting baseball. I mean, I think that's pretty indisputable at that point, is that it's going to be weird, and it's going to be it might not happen. Baseball for the rest of the season, it might not happen, and that's something that I wasn't quite expecting to happen this quickly. But take advantage of the fact that there are sports there. I mean, so many podcasts, so many people, I've tried not to complain about this. It's just a conversation. I'm trying really hard not to complain about the optics of fans, because it's just unnecessary to complain about the optics of fans. If you love baseball, if you love basketball, just enjoy the fact that the sports are back, rather than being upset about something that you knew was going to happen. It shouldn't impact you that much. It just shouldn't. And everybody has spent so much time on, ESPN shows and podcasts talking about how weird it is and how I'm not sure I'm going to be able to get used to it. Like, just enjoy the game. Maybe don't wonder and look at you try to find somebody to look at in the stands. Maybe watch the game that's happening in front of you. Just a thought. maybe that's just me, and maybe we're learning that people watch games because of what's happening in the stands rather than what's happening on the court. I will never understand why that's such a big deal for people, because you're there to watch the game, not to watch the fans in the stadium also watching the game. So why are you so annoyed with what's happening in the stands? But hey, that's just me. Let's get to FY real quick. I don't have very many for you today. If you're just joining the show here at the end, FY number 1, there are 14 at least Marlins players and coaches who have contracted COVID-19. That's tough. That's really insensitive. That's horrible, and hopefully it doesn't result in a spread to everybody that the Marlins have come in contact with since essentially the beginning of last week when they played in Atlanta against the Braves in an exhibition. I think we're going to learn really quickly if baseball can continue. There's, as Chris said when he was on the show, there's an owners meeting at 12:30 Eastern, and so we'll get some sort of answer, I feel like, in the next couple of hours. Hopefully Manfred responds in a way that shows any type of leadership. I know that's a stretch for him nowadays, but maybe that'll actually happen. I'm looking at my Twitter feed here. There was a cat that tested positive for COVID-19 in the UK. Make of that what you will. Hopefully there's not an outbreak of COVID-19 among pets, because that would not be fun. Pets are supposed to be one of the things that comfort us nowadays, and let's not have it spreading from pets. And then, of course, for your information, tomorrow on the 110 Sports Network, Touchline Talk with Josh Doring at 11 a.m. Eastern, and Around the Bases with Chris Brown at 1 p.m. Eastern. Here's what I hope. I hope that Chris has a lot to talk about on the show tomorrow, and that one of those things is not the Major League Baseball season is canceled. Even if that, that's not to say that I don't think there's a lot of legitimacy to that. That's not to say that I don't necessarily think that will happen, but for his sake, I hope that he's got a lot to talk about, but not a lot to talk about when it comes to the cancellation of the season. 110sportsmedia.com. If you haven't checked out all the new content over there on the site today, please do, and all the other 110 Sports Media Network content. We have a new podcast that came out today, The Bonfire, simulating conversations that you'd have around a bonfire. Lawrence Kramer from the DePaul student newspaper on the first episode of that. You can find that on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. But we'll see what happens in the next couple days with sports in this country, and we'll react to it at the same time on Wednesday, 11 a.m. Eastern. Stay safe, and I'll see you then.